In this video, I took it upon myself to upgrade an older HP Pavilion 15 gaming laptop that I got about 4 years ago as a Christmas present. Now this laptop was always on the budget side. I got this for $400 and it was definitely not bad, and it's certainly still not bad, but there is definitely a few things that are keeping it from being at its top performance. And the main one being it has a traditional hard disk. There is no SSD. You can see it has 8 gigabytes of RAM in here, and it also has a Core i5 8th generation processor that turbos up to over 4 gigahertz. But you can see that disk usage spike up to 99%. This is a very sluggish drive, especially for boot up times, and this was always a gaming laptop, but it's not the best for gaming considering that it wasn't even an SSD. So I decided to take it upon myself to perform an upgrade. And I have never upgraded a laptop before. I don't have a whole lot of experience with taking electronics apart, but I'm probably going to be building a PC soon, at least I hope to, with the help of my friend. And I decided that I'm going to need to get at least some experience before that of taking electronics apart. So in order to figure out what components I needed, I took the old laptop apart. It came apart pretty easily, and I first discovered that the SSD I'd need to get was going to be limited by SATA. There are no PCIe expansion slots inside of this laptop motherboard, so I ended up going with this Western Digital 1 terabyte SSD. And, you know, it's not the most expensive SSD because it's only SATA, but it's going to do the job, and it's going to be way better than that old traditional magnetic hard disk. After that, I looked at the RAM I needed, and I noted the brand, type, and speed. So it is DDR4 2666 megahertz for the speed. So it's not the fastest RAM, but it's DDR4, and it's still okay. It's going to be decent. This laptop was never supposed to be super high performance. So I got the RAM, and as soon as all the components were here, I unboxed them and was ready to begin the upgrade. The first step was pretty simple. I just had to find a screwdriver that would fit these screws and remove the back panel. There are quite a few screws, and there are actually some of different sizes, but it was overall very easy to remove these screws and get inside of the laptop. With the back panel removed, we can now access everything on the inside of the laptop. You can see the RAM is right here, very easy to access. And then we also have the SATA hard disk in this corner right here, which is also very easy to access. Apple could learn a few things about things being easy to access inside of computers so that we can upgrade them. The first and by far the easiest step of this process was to upgrade the RAM. You actually have to take out the first stick because the way they're accessed, you can only access them from the bottom and right on top. So then I got my other stick of RAM. I realized my finger was accidentally touching the copper piece of it, and you're not supposed to do that, but it's very simple to upgrade. It can be a little bit of a tight squeeze to get it in there considering how small this RAM is and the fact that it's just a laptop, but overall I had no trouble aligning it and pushing it in, and then getting the older stick, the original one, and then putting it on the top slot right back where it was before, so that now we have 16 gigs of RAM instead of 8. The most tedious part of this upgrade was definitely replacing the drive. Now, the first thing I had to do was just unscrew all of the screws that hold this drive in place, which was pretty easy to do, but one thing I did do was take a picture of where all of the screws were located so that I didn't end up not knowing where all the screws go and which hole screws go in and which ones don't. Luckily, it was very easy to get this drive apart after unscrewing all the screws. At this point, I had to be really careful because it was time to disconnect the SATA connector. This thing is really small and delicate, and it was kind of stuck to this blue Swiss cheese looking thing, but luckily I was able to get the drive out without damaging the SATA connector. The next thing I needed to do was unscrew the screws that were holding the drive bracket in place, so this was what is kind of what the drive is nested in. And we're going to need these to transfer them to the new SSD, so I just had to unscrew them, and I also had to make sure how they were aligned so I could hook them up to the new SSD, and I was actually really glad I was filming this because I ended up not remembering which way they went on here, so I actually went back through my camera footage to figure out what direction these drive brackets went on because I needed them when I was installing them on the new SSD. I would have been able to figure it out, but it didn't take very long because I had the camera footage. At this point, I was visibly struggling to remove the SATA connector from the old hard drive. I did get it eventually, but I actually did, you can't see it on camera a whole lot, but I did break a piece of plastic. It's not going to break anything functionally, but it is definitely a bit looser now. Luckily, I didn't yank on it any harder or else I would have really broken it and destroyed the connection, but you really have to be careful with these things, and at this point all I had to do was put that connector into the new SATA SSD and put the drive brackets on and reinstall it into the motherboard. At this point, I just had to put the drive brackets onto the new SSD so that we could install it back into the computer, and I couldn't really figure out how to align them at first. I ended up looking back through my camera footage, like I mentioned earlier, to figure out what the right alignment of these drive brackets were. It wouldn't have been the end of the world if I didn't have the camera footage, as I could have just played around with a few different layouts and kind of sat it in the motherboard to see how it would have fit. But this is where it was pretty easy, just because I had the footage already. But I just had to get those screws and then put the brackets back in so that I could secure the new SSD into those brackets. With the most tedious part of this process behind me, it was now time to seat the new SSD into the motherboard, install the screws, and reconnect the SATA connector to the motherboard. I was now done inside of the computer, and it was time to reinstall the back panel and put all those screws back in. And although I'm showing it now, I actually waited until the very end to put the screws back in. I installed the operating system and did all of my testing first before I put the screws in, just because I wanted to make sure that everything was working fine so that I didn't have to go to all the trouble of taking all those screws out again in case I needed to get back inside. At this point, it was time for the ultimate test, to see if the computer would still boot and recognize the SSD. At this screen, I let out a huge sigh of relief because I knew it detected the new drive and all I had to do was install Windows on it. I used a USB flash drive that I created using Microsoft's Windows Media Creation tool to put Windows 10 onto this USB. I just had to go into the BIOS and change the boot order from the OS Boot Manager to the USB drive, and after that, installing Windows 10 was very simple. I kind of considered going for 11 because that's what I've been using on my main device, but I figured it would be better to kind of compare speeds and how things go using Windows 10 because that's what this laptop has always used in the past, so I figured it would be a bit more of a fair comparison to see how much it's improved. So I went ahead and installed Windows 10 and it went very well. With Windows up and running, I was able to prove that it's an SSD now instead of a hard drive, and that it also detected the new 16 gigabytes of memory. And this computer runs so much better than it ever did before. When I first started using it after Windows was installed, it kind of, like on first boot up, it almost ran kind of as choppily as it did before, but after installing Windows updates and after getting drivers installed, everything worked perfectly. It was so much faster, and it's just, the difference is obvious. You could never go back to a traditional hard disk after upgrading. There were a few things that didn't quite work correctly after I set it up. My HDMI port no longer worked. When I connected my monitor to it, it would not work. And the other thing was my touchpad, the 2-finger scrolling didn't work. Luckily though, I was able to fix the touchpad issue by going to it was optional updates, and then finding the touchpad driver. For some reason, Windows didn't prioritize it as a primary driver, so I had to kind of go manually find it in Windows Update. But once I installed that and restarted, the touchpad 2-finger scrolling worked perfectly. What was really weird about the HDMI thing is I thought I had physically damaged the port when I opened up the computer. I'm like, well, great, I'm never going to be able to hook any external monitors up to it ever again. But luckily, restarting just kind of fixed that. I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but it only started working after I got the NVIDIA driver installed, the 1050 Ti graphics card. The game ready driver, it was kind of after that reboot that everything just kind of started working. So luckily everything ended up working perfectly, and it still does. I have since upgraded it to Windows 11 and it works perfectly fine, just as well if not better than it did with Windows 10. So overall, a very successful experiment. It was the first time I upgraded anything and changed anything inside of a computer. It went really well. If you're planning on doing this yourself, you just have to make sure you watch enough YouTube videos beforehand and do enough research, and it should be no problem for you. But thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.